Hello beautiful people, my name is Vendi and welcome to my first video of 2021. We made it. I'm not going to talk too much about 2020 because we're starting fresh. We are blank slating the world and doing a reset. There's a lot to fix. We all know that there's a lot to fix, but I feel like we can finally begin to heal. Though I guess it's a little bit dishonest of me to say that I'm not going to be talking about 2020 because this entire video is going to be a recap of my reading life for the past year. That includes a sort of recap on my top 5 goals of the past year and seeing how well I've done them, as well as some fun stats about the books that I've read. For a variety of reasons, 2020 wasn't the most prolific of reading years for me, but I still have some fun stats to show you, some fun things to share, so I think it's best if we just get started. So as I alluded to, I did not read as much last year as I normally do. I read a total of 62 books in the year 2020. These books had a total of 23,886 pages. And though I didn't rate them publicly, my overall rating for the year of 2020 was 4.22, which is surprisingly high. I may not have read too many books, but it seems like I really enjoyed the ones that I read. On the page on either side of my head, I will have bar graphs showing the total number of books that I read per month. You can see the fluctuations, and the ratings will be in a little line next to the bars showing how many books or pages that I've read in that given month. As you'll be able to see, the bar graph with the total number of books that I read per month is going to be more or less level with the ones totaling how many pages I read. For the most part, the more books you read, the more pages you read, but on occasion, for example, in April and October, notably, the number of pages that I read is considerably higher than the number of books that I read. With the closing of physical library locations, I think it shouldn't come as a surprise that nearly 50% of the books that I read in the past year came from the library. 34% of the books that I read were ebooks, almost all exclusively borrowed via my Libby app. And fully every single audiobook that I read was borrowed on Libby, and I read 15% of my books via audio this past year. For the rest, the breakdowns were fairly normal for me. Of my physically owned or borrowed physically from friends books that I read in the past year, 20% were hardcovers, 23% were paperbacks, and 8% were ARCs. If we get to the breakdowns of the types of books that I read, it was very clear just by looking at these percentages that I was reading very much as like a comforting escape. A full 66% of the books that I read last year were fantasy. That's 2/3 of the books that I read were some sort of fantasy, whether it's high fantasy, urban fantasy, a different sort of subgenre within the fantasy realm. This isn't really surprising. Fantasy is by far my most predominantly loved and owned and reached for genre, but especially in times of strife, I find that fantasy provides the best sort of escapism for me, so it does not surprise me in the slightest that rather than, branching out with my reading tastes, I was definitely going for, the tried and true favorites. And I do have to wonder if part of my 4.22 out of 5-star rating happened because I was reading a bunch of really good fantasy. I guess my main takeaway here is people like what they like, and I'm not an exception to that rule. What was a little bit surprising is that only 3% of the books that I read were sci-fi. That is an exceedingly low number for what I've considered to be my second favorite genre. I think it's because more so than fantasy, for example, or these sorts of contemporaries that I read, the sci-fi that I often reach for tends to skew a little dystopian, and that felt a little too much like the real world. So I didn't really feel as comforted by those books as I normally do. It didn't feel like a distant impossibility, sort of horrible things that happen in sci-fi universes. They felt very, very, very present. So I sort of steered clear of those for a little bit. And then, coming as a shock to me more than I think anybody else, a full 24% of the books that I read were contemporary or historical and had no sort of spec-fic element to them, which is kind of unheard of for me. I read so much romance, so much more romance than I think I ever have in my entire life, and I really enjoyed it. I guess this was the other side of the coin to that feel-good sort of escapist thing that I was going for this past year. Romance is relatively formulaic as a genre, and the vast majority of this contemporary section either had romance as a super, super heavy subplot, or it was, a romance book, so it was the main genre of the book that I was reading. So the stakes felt relatively low, and the feelings I got at the end were really uplifting and high-inducing and wonderful. And for the non-romance-based contemporaries that I read this past year, they were just really sweet and feel good. The vast majority of them reminded me of the world that's going to be waiting for us at the other side of this pandemic. The last category I have in this section is just other or miscellaneous. This encompasses horror books, thriller books, memoirs, etc. I didn't read enough examples of books in any of these genres that I thought naming them individually would be worth putting down. For most of it was like one or maybe two examples total that I had to list, and I thought it was best to just group them all together anyway. It's not a big section. I don't have much to say about these. So a stat block that was relatively interesting to me and that I really want to share with you is that when I break down my books that I read by series position, which is what I'm calling it, a good chunk of the books that I read this past year were standalones. I don't normally read a lot of standalones. As a huge fantasy reader, I'm generally a series kind of person, but more than a total third of the books that I read were standalones. 35% of the books that I read this year were standalones by themselves. And another 8% of those books were companion books, meaning that they're sort of in a series, like you don't really have to read them in any sort of order, and they could technically be read as standalones. And I'm pretty sure that at least in a couple cases, some of the companions I read, I only read one of them. You can see how small my attention span was, basically. I didn't really have the mental energy to devote myself to starting and finishing a full series, which I think is reflected when you look at the stats for the books that are actually part of series in this series position stat block. 31% of the books that I read were the first books in a series, so opening a series. And then that number drops really dramatically to 13% when you look at the second book or continuation of the series. And the lowest number of all goes to finales, of which I only read 10%. I did not do a lot of finishing of series. Like I said, a lot of bandwidth taken up. That's definitely something that I would like to correct moving forward. And as far as breaking these books down by age range, absolutely no surprise to me. There was a pretty even split between adult and YA lit, with a little slice of the pie going to middle grade as well. Truthfully, I'm surprised that the middle grade slice, which is 8%, is as big as it is. I do want to sort of expand my reading in the middle grade genre world, but those are not always books that it's easiest to find on Libby, and also I don't own any personally. That is definitely something I would like to change because of all the middle grade that I read, I really enjoyed basically all of it. We're moving along to breakdowns by author's race and gender. The author gender one is relatively standard for me and sort of par for the course for the types of books that I read. 72% of the authors that I read identified as women, 17% identified as men, and 11% were non-binary. This is definitely an uptick from the number of non-binary authors that I read in the past, and is a number that I am continually trying to increase. And the breakdown by author race isn't quite where I wanted it to be, but it is definitely forward momentum based on the goals that I set for myself last year. 56% of the authors that I read were white of varying ethnicities and nationalities, 20% were Black, 18% were Asian, 5% were Latina, and 1% were Middle Eastern. It wasn't until I made the stat block that I realized that I didn't read any books by Native American, Indigenous American folks, which is definitely something that I'm going to be working to correct in 2021. Of the authors that I read, 44% were writing own voices books, in many cases bringing aspects of their own life regarding their sexualities or their racial identities or an intersection of both into the story that they were telling. And that's another number that I definitely want to increase. Before I go into my reading goals for 2021, which I mentioned a few here and there while talking about my stat blocks, but I will get a little more into depth on those shortly. I want to first review the goals that I set for myself in 2020 and see how I did there. The first goal that I set for myself last year was to ensure that about 50% of the books that I read were written by authors of color and or queer authors. As far as reading from authors that are part of the LGBT+ community, I definitely knocked it out of the park, and I'm relatively close with my authors of color. That is definitely a number that I am going to actively increase because evidently just sort of picking things up on a whim isn't going crazy well for me. This is evidently a goal that for me is going to take more active doing, actively reaching for authors of color on my shelves, particularly authors of color who perhaps have intersections with queerness as part of their identity, and generally diversifying my reading more, not just as an incidental, oh, I've picked up a book and oh, this happens to be here thing, but no, going out of my way and choosing stories by authors of color. So I'm trying to grade how many of these goals I've got. I would say that I get like half a point for this one. The second goal I set out for myself was to get my physical TBR down by like 40 to 55 books, and I absolutely did not do that. I know I completely dropped the ball on this one. I gained some books, not by much, but my physical TBR definitely increased more than it decreased. So no points for me on that one. My third main goal was to read fewer than 75 books and to instead use that time to prioritize my writing. I absolutely did this one. My sort of tentative goals were to edit one manuscript, outline another, and write another, and I got 2.5 out of 3 of those, so I'm definitely giving myself a point for that one. I definitely prioritized writing last year. It was one of the few things that kept me sane. The fourth main goal I had was to DNF ruthlessly, and I'm giving myself a point for this one only because of how well I knocked the other one out of the park. I definitely gave myself permission to DNF, and I took advantage of it maybe once or twice, but I didn't, for the most part, need to. Like I said, 4.22 out of 5 rating for the majority of the year. That's pretty good. I was reaching for things that I liked, and I don't know if it was just good instinct or if it was just like fate and karma tossing me a boon. They were like, listen, you're going through it. We know you need something good in your life, and then just giving me good books in my path. But I didn't really have to DNF. I'm still counting the point though. And my fifth goal was to stop rating books publicly, not reviewing, but rating books. And again, another one that I knocked completely out of the park. This one was easy. It was a really passive goal. It's a lot easier to not do something than it is to do it. But I'm taking wins where I can get them, so I'm giving myself a point here, leading to a total of 3.5 out of 5 points for my top 5 goals of last year. That's not bad, but I think it can do better, and here is what I'm going to be attempting to do in the year going forward. The first one is very much a response to the first goal that I had last year. I'm doing great reading queer authors. I'm doing awesome at that. So very specifically, I'm going to focus on ensuring that the authors of color that I read basically outnumber the white authors that I read for the year of 2021. I'm not going for like a crazy high overhaul. 55 to 60% will be a good start until one day in my life. It's not a thing I'm actively doing too much thinking about, but evidently I'm not at that point yet. So this is something that I'm actively working towards. And so far, midway through January, it appears to be going well. So keep your fingers crossed for me. The second goal that I have for 2021, I know I just said I was pretty much knocking it out of the park, reading books by LGBT+ authors. I want to keep that ball rolling. I want to continue reading by queer authors, but specifically I want to be reading queer stories, if that makes sense. Books that center being LGBT+ from obviously own voices authors. I'm not really here to read a straight person's interpretation of what a queer experience is like. But I want to do that. I want to read more queer joy from joyful queer people. This is a goal for 2021 because of how much joy it brought me in 2020. And if I put it down as a goal, I'm more likely to actually do it. My third main goal goes back to the physical TBR. I'm going to be a little less strict with myself with specific numbers, but I just simply want to read more books that I own physically than I want to read from the library. I'm going to try to read 2 books that I physically own for every 1 book that I read from the library. My fifth goal is my Goodreads challenge, basically. I want to read 52 books and perhaps more. I'm not going to set myself like an upper limit like I did last year, but my primary goal, again, will be to focus on my writing. I might be lowballing myself a little bit, but at the same time as I'll be focusing on my writing, I will also be full-time employed and working on my master's. So reading 1 book a week seems like plenty. I'll probably overshoot by a little, just based on how the start of the year is going. But that's okay. I'm okay with more than that, but 52 is, I think, the minimum that I want to reach. This is a hobby that I love, not just reading, but BookTube. I really like doing this, and reading books, that's how I make my content. So definitely going to be keeping that fresh and updated so that I can be on here more often. But I think the main goal of all of this is to maybe not be as hard on myself. I set a lot of very lofty goals for myself, and it makes them very, very difficult to actually fulfill when times are tough. So in case times stay tough, my primary overarching goal, right, goal 0, is to just have fun with my reading and with video making and with writing and with all the other things that I have to and want to do. Because if you're not having fun, if you're not enjoying yourself, is there really a point to any of this? And with that perhaps too philosophical question, I'm going to end the video. That is it. That's my 2020 reading wrap up and my 2021 reading goals. If you like this video, please leave me a thumbs up, and if you like me, maybe consider subscribing to this channel. I will actually be posting videos every weekend of 2021, and I would love to have you join me and become part of my little booktube family here. If you have any reading goals for 2021, I want to hear about them. Comment them down below and we can compare notes and commiserate and do our best to make this year a better one than the last was. Until then, you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Goodreads. All of my socials are linked in the description box below. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you with another video very, very soon. Goodbye.